Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 11th, 1984, runners Zola Budd and Mary Decker square off in Los Angeles at the Olympic 3,000-meter final. Some highlights of the 84 Olympics. Carl Lewis won more track and field medals than any other American since Jesse Owens. A Chinese athlete won a medal for the first time in those summer games, which is kind of crazy considering how successful China has been in the years since. The Olympics themselves were considered a financial success, which is very rare. LA was largely using existing infrastructure, not sinking too much into the games themselves. There was, of course, the boycott by Russia. This is the height of the Cold War, remember? But actually, if you kind of put yourself in that summer of 84. One of the most hyped up moments was that 3,000-meter final. The American Mary Decker was poised to win the gold, and she'd been denied the chance to do that 4 years earlier because of the U.S. boycott of the games in Russia. And then here was Zola Budd, a South African runner who was running under the English flag, which we'll get into, and had all sorts of implications. And then just with about 3 laps to go in the race, there was a collision, an entanglement, perhaps a tripping, perhaps an intentional tripping. Budd and Decker's legs got tangled. Decker, the favorite, the American, went down. Budd faded back, finished way back, and the two were kind of forever linked because of this moment, which is a wild sporting moment, of course, but also there's this massive geopolitical context to it all. So let's talk about Budd versus Decker and the trip seen around the world. I don't know if that's something that I can coin here or not, but people were watching this all around the world. So here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
All right. I want to break down exactly what happened here and the political context. But look, I don't know, Kellie, you were telling us just before we started recording, you went like full Zapruder film on this video. You watched it over and over and over on the trip.
I did. I mean, it was, you know how like you're like, rewind, fast forward, rewind, wait, what happened? And my husband was watching me actually watch these videos. He was like, oh yeah, I remember that. I was like, dude, you were 4. He was like, and he was like, no, I remember watching the Olympics, asking my parents, why is that woman crying? Why is she crying? And I was like, that probably tracks, because I remember watching the Olympics with key pivotal moments and seeing where people fell or tripped and sort of wondering what happened or jumped the gun before the shot was fired and stuff like that. So, yeah, it was wild to rewatch, I suppose I could say, and also sort of like do forensics on what might have happened.
And there's also, I mean, we should say there's this image, this iconic image of like Decker kind of on the ground after she'd fallen. She's like watching the other runners pull away, and she's like sort of yelling out in anguish with I think a medical trainer kind of hugging her. And so that's like a iconic moment too that has seared this in people's imaginations for sure.
It's certainly reminiscent, I think, of that Nancy Kerrigan image of the Why Me moment.
Yes.
I had a flashback to that. But I think, Kellie, that the need to Zapruder that moment speaks to how kind of chaotic might be the wrong word, but just how packed the field was. I mean, if you look at images of this race, everyone's kind of on top of one another. And I think that is why it's a little murky as to who tripped whom, how purposeful it was. I mean, it could have easily been accidental.
Yeah. And I think it kind of was accidental. I mean, when you're running in a pack like that, it's kind of hard not to, rub elbows, trip over someone's feet, get roughed up a little bit.
Yeah. And the reporting after the fact, and by all accounts, it is that like there were a couple little other collisions. I mean, I think people, to your point, when they're running in packs like this and waiting to separate from the packs, they are often like bumping each other and jockeying for position until those final laps. And this is right at that moment, 3 laps left in a very long race where someone's kind of, people are making moves and so forth. And so, they had like collided a little bit at 1,700 meters as the first contact. And then 5 strides later, Budd and Decker make a similar contact. And then something happens and Budd's left foot hits Decker's thigh. Budd loses her balance, the South African loses her balance, and then goes into Decker's path, and then gets hit, and her running shoe comes down on Budd's ankle, drawing blood, and then Decker goes down in pain and off to the side, and then I guess we should say, and this gets in, we'll get back to this, but then the race goes on, obviously. Decker is out, the American is out, the favorite is out, and Budd her like main rival, at least in the media's imagination, really fades back at that point. And we'll talk about why, but, finishes 7th, I believe. But I guess we'll come back to the race itself, but we should lay out both the sporting and the geopolitical context of why it was that these two, it is one of those classic sporting moments where it's like these two were kind of pitted against each other. And then, of course, it had to be that it was these two who get entangled and have this moment, right? But why was there this like Bud versus Decker thing being hyped up? What was going on there?
Well, one thing is that they are both remarkably fast women who had not won Olympic gold, who in fact hadn't competed in Olympic Games before, even though they had been setting records in their respective parts of the world. Decker, because she had an injury in 76, you mentioned the boycott in 80, and Bud, because she was South African. And this is where, obviously the boycott of the Moscow Olympics suggests that geopolitics often comes into play in the Olympics. But in the case of South Africa, South Africans had not been allowed to participate in the Olympics since 1960, and they wouldn't be allowed until 1992 because of how awful the apartheid regime they were instituting during those years was, relocating Black South Africans, stripping them of their citizenship, outlawing opposition, jailing Nelson Mandela. All of these things are happening in the early 1960s. And the Olympic Committee is like, guys, there's a ban on discrimination in the rules of the game. And even though we can talk about like places like the United States that had discriminatory regimes, like there were plenty of places that had bad records on human rights, but there was something particular about apartheid and the way that it was being put into effect that led to this outraged international response and led to this kind of banning of South Africa from the Olympics.
Yeah, and because of this, it's interesting because Bud can't really run as a South African runner because of the sanctions, because of this, political and public shunning of South Africa. She finds kind of a backdoor in by using her grandfather's birth in London, or his ancestry, British ancestry. She uses that as like a backdoor to go in and to get a British passport. But what's shady about it is that it was highly expedited. Like no one gets a passport quicker than Bud does for the purposes of running in the Olympics. So it was a lot of backlash there where people were like, hey, listen, people have been waiting for years to get this passport. Now, because she's an Olympic athlete and chooses to run for the British because of, a somewhat distant relative's ancestry, she gets a pass.
Yeah, that happened in 13 days that she got citizenship. Yeah. And it was a campaign that was led by the right-wing publication, the Daily Mail. And so there was a politics to drumming up support for her.
Yeah, and I think people who know the Daily Mail and that the Daily Mail was hyping this up, it's the equivalent of like if the New York Post gets behind something here, it probably tells you something. But I don't think that's like that Bud was actually pro-apartheid, right? She wanted to race. But I do think it drops into the middle of this incredibly, and it's hard to overstate how heated this sort of cultural and sporting boycott, not to mention political and economic boycott of South Africa was. And it gets sort of dropped into the middle of this, and she works this loophole with the Daily Mail hyping it up, basically running a campaign to apply pressure on the British government to grant her citizenship. And a lot of people who support the boycott and think, South African athletes should be shunned and not be allowed to participate. White South African athletes kind of really take issue with this. We have some examples of that, but I'm just curious. I just sort of really wrestle with this question of, and we're wrestling with it now too, with Russia and other places, it coming down on individual athletes who just want to compete, and I get the idea at a geopolitical state-by-state level, or country-to-country level, like a ban, but to tell a specific athlete you can't compete, if they haven't taken a political stance in whatever way, just by dint of the country you were born in. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's not just the athlete, but all athletes from that country get marginalized. And so, we've seen this a lot with Russia, where it makes it really difficult for people to get go-arounds. And for something like the Olympics, again, this is not an annual event. This is every 4 years. Most people only get one opportunity, maybe two, if you're an elite 3 times to go. But this is a sport that just doesn't allow many opportunities for a return. And so, she took her opportunity.
Maybe one way to help put a finer point on it, or to clarify why there was such unified opposition to this, is because it wasn't just that South Africa was an apartheid regime, but it had applied apartheid to its own Olympics committee, right? They did not allow Black South Africans to participate in sports, to be on the Olympic team. And so every sporting opportunity was limited to white athletes. And that, I think, is because that level of segregation at the sport level led to the Olympic Committee to be like, look, lots of countries have problems. Your problem is front and center when it comes to your Olympic team. Yes, it comes down on those athletes, but it is like the whole athletic system in the country is so corrupted by apartheid that it makes it, you feel bad for them, but at the same time you're like,
no, and that's how strikes and boycotts work, right? I mean, they have to be sort of across the board, or if you just sort of carve out loophole after loophole after loophole, then at some point they just don't work.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
So yes, there was a lot of pushback on this move, both, as we said, because of the loophole that gets exploited to expedite her citizenship, and also just this larger geopolitical context. My favorite example of the pushback here is the band Chumbawamba, which is, I don't know if that rings a bell to anyone. They had this hit in the 90s that was a kind of like silly party song, and everyone thought they were just kind of like a silly Tub Thumping. They thought they were a silly band, but actually that band is a like deeply political, long-standing, like basically anarchist British like punk band that happened to have this one-hit wonder in the 90s, but like throughout the 80s and 90s they were like mostly truly livid. If you ever want to go and read about Chumbawamba, like they were like living in communes, living their values, like they were at it. And they wrote a song about Zola Budd that's called Zola Budd, basically protesting her. And, you know, the lyrics are like, she's a slip of a girl to be out of school. She's a product of apartheid. She won her spurs under minority rule. She's a product of apartheid. Afrikaners run best. She's a slip of a girl, but at least she's white. She's a slip of a girl, but at least she's white. And so there you go. You have, you know, political musicians writing songs about Zola Budd.
But wait, hold up.
Yeah.
Was anybody talking about the fact that she ran barefoot? Because to me, that's questionable too. I'm like, wait, what? When I watched the footage,
well, that's the other reason people know her. It's kind of amazing. But yeah, barefoot running.
I don't know how you run barefoot. And
Kellie, you are opening a can of worms. The running community is so, like, barefoot runners are, let's say, devoted to their form of running. They're coming for you.
One of my best friends'
so you won't be able to hear
grandfathers
them.
was like a legendary barefoot runner who had all sorts of records and stuff.
What about nails? What about rocks?
It's crazy.
What about the calluses? I can't.
The sole of your foot becomes the shoe.
I can't. That's where I draw the line at shoes.
So we have Bud. They sort of, the Daily Mail is like waving this flag for her. She competes under what people have called the sort of flag of convenience, that she can now run for England. Let's bring it back to this moment. She shows up in 84. They have this race. They have this quote-unquote trip. I suppose we should now talk about aftermath and kind of what we learned after this incident. Maybe let's start with, you know, why Bud... Decker's clearly out, the American, and the favorite, but Bud fades really far back, and she says some interesting things after the fact about kind of why that happened.
I think she felt horrible. I think she talked about how the crowd started to boo her, and that she lost her will to run, that she essentially gave up. You know, perhaps she could have placed, maybe not come in first, but placed. And that moment completely unmoored her. And so, it caused her to lose the race.
There'd already been so much controversy around her participation, and now she's running in front of an American crowd. She's just taken out the American favorite for the gold. That is not a crowd that is going to be cheering her along. You can understand why she might feel her head was a little out of the game.
Totally, yeah. And, so they did a reunion in 2016. There was a documentary about this moment, and that's exactly what Bud says. She says the crowd starts booing, and then she basically says everything leading up to it, the politics, the hype, then Mary falling. It was like a soap opera. I slowed down deliberately. I didn't want to be on the medal podium after that, which, it's really, you can imagine what's going through her mind. They do this documentary in 2016. I would say, I wouldn't say they're like totally reconciled or pals. I mean, it's still a very fraught moment in both of their. Okay, there you go. It's a very fraught moment in both their careers for sure. And there's reports of kind of even immediately after, like Bud tried to apologize to Decker in the tunnel, and everything was still obviously very heated and fraught, and that did not go very well. But anything else about their legacies or their careers after this that you want to add as we wrap up?
I will say this about Bud. Bud goes on she continues to run, but then she moves to South Carolina and she becomes an assistant coach for a track team in South Carolina, which I find just kind of amazing.
Yeah, just has to find some work, I suppose.
Everybody's got to eat, right? Everybody's got to eat.
Apparently, in South Africa still, very fast taxis are referred to as Zola Buds in the townships because they go so fast. So her name is still synonymous with speed, which I like.
Well, both women were two of the fastest women on the official running circuit, and the fact that I don't think either one won an Olympic medal at all across the course of their careers, which I think is interesting. Yeah. Sometimes the timing doesn't work out.
Yeah.
All right, well, we will leave it there, and we will say thank you to our listener, Julie, who suggested this episode. That was really, always love to get suggestions like this. So, thanks to Julie. And as always, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Zola Bud tried to cut in without being basically ahead, and I think her foot caught me, and to avoid pushing her, I fell. I mean, when I think about it now, I should have pushed her, but if I had pushed her, tomorrow the headlines would have read Decker shoved Zola.
Radiotopia.